The gardener was in handcuffs, until the parrot speaks a phrase that changes everything. The afternoon was hot and still when the two police officers came through the iron gate of Willow Creek Manor without announcing themselves. Silas didn't hear the car stop outside. He was crouched in the damp soil, his hands inside a box of lavender seedlings, focused on his work, as he always was. 15 years doing that had given him a kind of peace that only working with one's hands can offer. The kind of peace that silences thought and leaves only the smell of the earth and the sound of the birds. When he raised his head, the two uniformed men were already in the middle of the cobblestone driveway that cut through the garden, coming toward him with a step that didn't need words to say something was wrong. Silas stood up slowly, wiped his hands on the cloth he carried at his belt. His heart raced before his mind could understand why. One of the officers spoke his name as if it were a question that already had an answer. He said yes, and waited. What he heard next didn't make sense. A piece of jewelry had gone missing from the residence, a silver brooch with sapphire stones, a family heirloom worth far more than money. And the name that had been given as a suspect was his. Silas stood staring at those two faces, unable to find any words. 15 years. 15 years arriving early, leaving late, learning every inch of that garden as if it were an extension of his own body. 15 years knowing the name of every plant, the right time for each watering, the mood of the sky before rain. 15 years being the trusted one. And now this. He tried to explain. Said he had never entered the lady of the house's bedroom in 15 years, that this was a line that had never been crossed, that there was a serious mistake here. The second officer, a young man with a closed face and eyes that let nothing through, said a member of the family had made the report, that there were circumstances that needed to be investigated, that it was better to come along without resistance. The handcuffs closed around Silas's wrists with a click he felt in his teeth. That's when Buster started screaming. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The parrot was in the big cage on the covered porch, that black iron cage that Mrs. Martha had ordered, made special because Buster deserved room to move. The creature was a green parrot with red spots on its wings, dark round eyes, and a beak that seemed to have its own opinion about everything. Silas had taught half of its vocabulary over the years. Every morning, while watering the plants near the porch, the two of them would be there, one talking, the other repeating, building between them that strange complicity that only someone who has had a creature like that can truly understand. Now Buster moved restlessly from one perch to another inside the cage, beak open, screaming something that came out jumbled. The officers paid no attention to the bird. Silas turned his face toward it while being led along the stone path. He wanted to hear what the creature was saying, but the words came out scrambled in the agitation, and the officer holding his arm quickened his pace without giving him time for anything. Mrs. Martha appeared at the main door of the house at that moment, 72 years old, completely white hair pinned in a low bun that she had worn since she was young out of habit, not vanity. A woman small in stature, but who never needed height to fill a room. Silas knew her well enough to know that the expression on her face at that moment was not her usual one. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper and more painful than anger. It was confusion. And behind the confusion, there was something that looked like shame. She looked at Silas with eyes that hurt more than any words could. He said her name, just once. The way someone asks for an explanation they're not sure will come. She closed her eyes for a second, and behind her, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and a half smile on his lips that Silas couldn't ignore, stood Preston. Mrs. Martha's nephew had arrived 12 days earlier, without warning, with 2 large suitcases and a vacation story that didn't convince anyone who was paying attention. Silas had noticed since the first day that that man wasn't there to rest. He walked through the house with that manner of someone doing a survey, opening cabinets with a naturalness that wasn't like a guest talking to Mrs. Martha about Willow Creek Manor, with a curiosity that sounded more like an inventory than family conversation. Preston was 54 years old, well-dressed, and spoke with that ease of someone who learned early on that appearance can substitute for honesty for a long time before anyone notices. Silas hadn't liked him since the first handshake, but it was never his place to say anything. Never. Now, looking at that half-smile planted on Preston's face while he was in handcuffs in the very garden he had tended for 15 years, something inside Silas began to click into place in a way that hurt. Mrs. Martha came down the 2 steps of the entrance and stood at a distance, as if getting too close could hurt either of them. She said the brooch had gone missing that afternoon, that it was her husband's mother-in-law's, that he had given it to her when they got married, that it was the most important piece she had in her entire life, and that she herself didn't want to believe it, but that the circumstances— Preston finished the sentence with that smooth, measured voice of someone who had rehearsed. He said Silas was the only one who had moved through the inner area of the house that afternoon, that he himself had seen the gardener near the hallway that led to Mrs. Martha's room, that he wasn't accusing anyone, he was just reporting what he had seen with his own eyes. Silas felt his stomach turn. In 15 years he had never entered that hallway. There was an unspoken agreement with Mrs. Martha from the start. The garden was his, the house was hers. Silas knew that better than he knew the name of any flower in there. But Preston's words had that dangerous quality of well-constructed lies. They sounded reasonable enough to confuse anyone who had no way to prove otherwise. Mrs. Martha looked at Silas with those eyes that no longer knew where to land. And Silas, for the first time in 15 years, didn't know what to say to her. There are things you can't defend because you never imagined you'd have to defend them. True trust doesn't come with documentation. When someone decides to destroy that trust from within, you stand there, hands tied in the most literal sense that exists. The police officers waited with that professional patience that isn't a lack of hurry. It's habit. And then Buster cried out again, this time differently. The bird's voice came out organized, clear, with that precision parrots have when they repeat something they've heard many times in the same context. Buster had tilted his head to the side, eyes fixed on Preston, and repeated the same thing 3 times in a row without stopping, with a firmness that couldn't be ignored. Preston hide in his pocket. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that weighs. One of the police officers looked at the bird, the other looked at Preston. Preston let out a laugh that came out a little wrong, too rushed. He said it was an animal, that creatures repeat what they hear without understanding any of what they're saying, that had no value at all. He said all of that with a steady voice, the voice of someone who's afraid but can't let it show. But Mrs. Martha wasn't laughing. She had known Buster for 11 years. He knew exactly how the bird worked. He knew it didn't invent sentences. It repeated what it heard, in the same context in which it had heard them. And that specific sentence, with that specific name, no one in the house had taught it. Not her, not Silas, not the young woman who came by twice a week to help with the cleaning. So where had it come from? Mrs. Martha's voice came out firmer than anyone expected to hear from her at that moment. She asked Preston to empty his pockets. Preston talked about humiliation. He said he was a blood nephew, that he was there because he cared about her, that he was being treated like a criminal in his own family's house. He said all of this with an indignation that sounded too rehearsed to be genuine. Mrs. Martha repeated the request, just once, with that serenity of someone who spent 7 decades learning that a loud voice isn't the same thing as being right. And Preston hesitated. Only 2 seconds. But 2 seconds are an eternity when everyone is looking at the same place. Look, that moment, when a person's hesitation says in 2 seconds what they would never say in words. It makes me think about how the truth always appears, not in a confession, not in a shout, in a pause. One of the police officers approached Preston calmly and asked for his cooperation. Preston stood still for another moment, as if calculating some way out that no longer existed. The garden was completely silent. Even the birds outside had stopped. Buster stayed quiet on his perch, head tilted, watching. Preston reached into his right pants pocket and placed in the palm of his own hand a silver brooch with sapphire stones. Mrs. Martha looked at it for a time that seemed to have no measure. She looked at the brooch. She looked at the hand holding it. She looked at her nephew's face with an expression that took Silas a while to identify. It wasn't anger. Anger, Silas knew. That was something else. It was the weight of discovering that a person you let into your home, into your story, was capable of doing that, with premeditation, with calm, looking into your eyes while doing it. The handcuffs came off Silas's wrists with the same dry click with which they had been put on, but that click sounded completely different. Silas stared at his own wrists for a moment. The marks were still on his skin. The dirt was still on his hands. The green shirt he was wearing had garden stains that wouldn't come out easily. Buster let out a low sound, almost a satisfied whistle, and stayed still. Silas would have laughed in any other circumstance, but at that moment he couldn't. The police officers asked Preston to accompany them to clarify the situation. He left by the same path he had come in without saying anything else. The last image Silas had of him was from behind, walking over the cobblestone driveway he himself had swept early that morning. The garden fell quiet. Mrs. Martha came down the 2 steps from the veranda and walked to where Silas was. She stood in front of him with those eyes that now had something different inside. No longer the weight of doubt. Now it was something else. It was shame, perhaps, the kind that comes from within a person when she realizes she was wrong about someone who didn't deserve it. She apologized. Her voice came out small, like someone who knows words don't come close enough to what needs to be said. Silas stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood, because he truly understood. He knew how Preston had built that. He knew Mrs. Martha had been put in an impossible position, with information that seemed too solid to ignore. Her fault wasn't believing the circumstances. The fault, if there was any, was having opened the door to someone she didn't know as well as she thought she did. But there are things we only find out later. Life doesn't warn us. The 2 of them stayed silent for a while there in the garden, as the afternoon cooled down a bit, and Buster started moving around in his cage again with that calm that birds have when they realize the danger has passed. It was Mrs. Martha who spoke first. She said that, over the past few days, she had noticed things that hadn't made sense at the time. Papers that had been moved on the desk, a conversation Preston had started about a nursing home she had never asked about, but that he had researched with a level of detail that wasn't typical of someone just passing through. He had arrived with a plan that needed Silas out of the way first. Silas heard that, and his stomach tightened in a different way this time, because suddenly the full scope of what had almost happened became clear. It wasn't just the brooch. The brooch was the first piece of a larger move. Preston wanted Silas to leave, or get arrested, or be discredited, because Silas was the only one who was there every day, who noticed things, who Mrs. Martha listened to with real trust. With him out of the way, she would be left without a faithful witness, more vulnerable to whatever came next. Mrs. Martha had figured this out on her own, the same way she figured out a lot of things in life. Late, but with a clarity that left no room for doubt. She said she was going to need to settle some matters definitively, that she was going to talk to whoever she needed to talk to. That Willow Creek Manor and everything in it were the result of 40 years of life with her husband, and they weren't going to change direction because of anyone's ambition. She said all of this with that calm voice that was more frightening than any shout. Silas looked at her and thought, not for the first time, that Mrs. Martha was the kind of person the world tries to bend her whole life, and that simply doesn't bend. Not out of stubbornness, something deeper, a clarity about who she was that even the years hadn't managed to cloud. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. In the days that followed, Willow Creek Manor went back to its usual rhythm, but with some new things that remained as a mark of that day. Mrs. Martha called her lawyer, a discreet woman she had known for many years, and took care of updating documents that made her intentions regarding the property clear. She did this with the serenity of someone putting her house in order, without drama, without rush, without needing anyone's approval. She told Silas she had learned the lesson late, but she had learned it. Preston didn't come back. There was a contact by message, then another, both with that tone that mixes regret with justification, which is the most common combination among people who have done wrong but can't fully admit it. Mrs. Martha replied once, with few words, and then let the silence do the rest. Silence, she knew, says things that speech never says with the same honesty. Silas kept showing up every day, just like he always had. He arrived at the same time, left when the work was done, treated every corner of the garden with the same care as before. But something had changed between the two of them, in a way that was hard to put into words. Before, there was that polite courtesy of employer and employee, with genuine affection underneath, kept in its proper place by habit and convenience. After that day, the courtesy was still there, but the affection occupied a different space. It had a name. It had weight. It had the honesty of two people who had seen the worst of a situation together and came out of it standing. Mrs. Martha started having afternoon tea on the porch while Silas finished his work. Sometimes they talked about the garden, sometimes about the nothing of a good afternoon. Sometimes they stayed quiet, each with their own thoughts, without the silence feeling heavy. Buster would contribute with some random phrase out of nowhere from time to time, and the two of them would laugh. On one of those afternoons, Silas asked where Buster had gotten that phrase from. Preston hides it in his pocket, because even knowing that the bird repeated what he heard, he needed to understand where it had come from. Mrs. Martha stayed quiet for a moment, looking at the garden with distant eyes. Then she said she remembered the scene, that on the afternoon the brooch went missing, she had left the bedroom for a few minutes to answer a phone call in the living room. When she came back, she had seen Preston leaving the hallway near the bedroom with quick steps. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, because he was home and it seemed natural. But she had said something to herself out loud, as she did ever since she became a widow, and the silence of the house grew too heavy. She said something like, "This brooch was right here on the dresser. Where did it go? I wonder if someone hid it in a pocket." She hadn't realized Buster was on the veranda right there, just outside the open window, listening to everything with that silent attention parrots have when no one is looking at them. Silas stared at the bird. Buster tilted his head to the side and said, with all the calm in the world, "In the pocket." The two of them laughed at the same time. There are some things only a parrot can solve. Not in a way we make up, but in a very real and very simple way. Sometimes the truth is right there in the room, and we don't hear it because we're not paying attention to the right place. The garden kept blooming over the following weeks, as a good garden always does when it's cared for properly. The lavender seedlings Silas had transplanted on the day of the handcuffs took root well, just as he knew they would from the start. He had an eye for that after so long. He could tell when a plant would survive just by looking at it, feeling the soil, noticing how the root was settling in. One Saturday morning, Mrs. Martha came out to the garden with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Silas without asking if he wanted it. She sat in a wicker chair she'd had brought outside long ago, but rarely used. The sun was still low, and the garden smelled of damp earth and lavender. She said she was thinking about expanding the garden. There was a little corner behind the house that had gone unused for years, and it could be turned into something. She asked Silas for his opinion. He looked at the space she was pointing to. He paused for a moment, calculating, imagining, as he did with any project before speaking. Then he said it could be turned into a vegetable patch. Not a big one, but enough to have fresh herbs, tomatoes, maybe a zucchini or 2. It would be more work, true, but good work. Mrs. Martha said she loved the idea, and that's how, with 2 people drinking coffee on a Saturday morning beside a garden that time had taught to exist through care, talking about zucchini as if absolutely nothing extraordinary had happened, that story found the place where it was meant to end. Not with fanfare, not with a speech, with coffee, with soil, with a green parrot who didn't exactly know what he had done that day, but had done it the right way anyway, the only way he knew how, repeating what he had heard at the right moment for the right person to hear. End of story. That was the story of Silas and Mrs. Martha, a story about what happens when you treat people well over many years, about how true trust doesn't just disappear because someone tries to destroy it from within, and about Buster, who in all honesty deserves special credit. He did for Silas that day what many people wouldn't do in a lifetime. If this story moved you in any way, tell us in the comments what you felt and where you're watching from. And do you think Mrs. Martha took too long to see what Preston was doing? We'd love to know your opinion. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories like this one.